You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Hello all, Eric Rivenis with the Most Notorious podcast here. Each week I interview an author or historian about a historical true crime, tragedy, or disaster. Subject matter ranges from gunslingers to Gilded Age murder to gangsters to fires to pirates to wild prison breaks. My guests bring their incredible knowledge directly to you. Please subscribe to Most Notorious on your favorite podcast app. Cheers, and have a safe tomorrow.
Hello everyone, and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 207, The Fall of France Epilogue, Riom. This week, a big thank you goes out to Nicholas and Sasha for their donations through Buy Me a Coffee, and trust me, this podcast runs on coffee. And to 1JNOFTZ, Russell, Mark, Henry, and Fire Queen, good name, for choosing to support this podcast by becoming members. You can find out more about becoming a member over at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. After the signing of the armistice with Germany, Pétain and his French government would form what would come to be known as the Vichy government, due to the fact that it was based in the town of Vichy, France. The full scope of the actions of the Vichy government is beyond the scope of this episode, and this series because it's deeply intertwined with many other events beyond the invasion of France. However, there is one event from the Vichy government's time in power that is deeply tied to the fall of France in 1940, and that is what is known as the Riom trial. The goal of the trial at Riom in 1942 was to find a person or a group of people to blame for the defeat of France in 1940, to determine who should be made the scapegoat for that failure, and then to sentence them appropriately. But the goals of that trial were more expansive than simply determining the root cause of the failure of the French army. Instead, it was driven by politics. Pétain and the other Vichy leaders were very concerned about sort of appearing to be the legitimate leaders of France, especially given the rising popularity of the Free France movement. The hope was that by pinning the blame for the defeat on some of the pre-war politicians of the Third Republic, Pétain could solidify himself as the new leader of France. The continued conflict between the right and the left of French politics also came into play at Riom, with the Vichy government representing the rightist authoritarian strand of French politics, and the defendants mostly being on the left side of the political spectrum. This meant that the goal of the trials was not just to place the blame on the pre-war politicians, but also to make the case that the entirety of the Third Republic was fatally weakened by socialism, and that socialism was embodied in the leader of the Popular Front, Léon Blum. This was a lot for the trial to accomplish, and there was a problem, because if the Vichy government wanted to pursue these goals of pinning all the blame on the Third Republic and on the socialists and on the governments of pre-war France, they had to get around one major unavoidable problem. They had all participated in French politics during the 1930s, they being the Vichy leaders. And there were two main ways that they sought to get around this problem. The first was by strictly limiting the scope of their inquiry, questioning, and investigation to be between March 1936 and September 3rd, 1939. This time period was a period when Pétain and Weygand and many other Vichy leaders were not directly involved in national French politics. And it was also the period, well, roughly the start of the period, when the Popular Front government was formed in 1936, the Popular Front government being the first socialist government in France, and it was followed by a series of leftist and center-leftist governments until the start of the war. The second method used to shift blame away from the Vichy leaders was through focusing the trial on 6 very specific men, their decisions, and the impact of those decisions. Riom was not necessarily an indictment on the French governments or all the French governments before the war, or the French military, all of the French military from before the war. But instead, they began to target just 6 men. The 6 men were the former Prime Minister Daladier and Blum, former head of the French Army General Gamelin, former Inspector General of the Army Pierre Jacomet, and then former Ministers of Aviation Pierre Cot and Guy Lacambre. The trial itself would end up taking place over 24 sessions, the first of which would take place on February 19, 1942, and then the last would take place on April 2nd. Because of the goals of the trial, the press, not just from France, but from all around the world, were invited to the proceedings. It was supposed to be a triumphant display of Vichy legitimacy, power, and importance. It was instead a complete and total disaster. The trial would go down as an incredible example of a self-own in which the Vichy government brought together a group of people that would spend the majority of the trial sessions attacking not just the Vichy leaders, but the very premise of the trial, and they would do so very convincingly. The root of the problem is that the Vichy leaders totally misunderstood how the defendants would use the stage that they were being put on. Instead of meekly going down without a fight, some of the defendants, particularly Daladier and Blum, went on the attack. Well, at least the verbal attack. It did help that many of the facts were on the side of the defendants, and they were both skilled at using those facts to demonstrate that the pre-war governments had done many of the correct things to prepare for the war. They instead were able to shift the blame onto the military and onto the French high command and to people like Pétain and Weygand and others who did not want it to be placed on them. Pétain was one of the most influential figures in shaping and structuring the interwar French military, and so if the defendants could place the blame on the military, they were coming very close to pinning it on Pétain himself, which was unacceptable. And so, on April 11, 1942, the trial was stopped. An excuse was given to delay it until a further date, but it would never start again. Again, these trials were a complete and total disaster, which is why I think this episode is going to be pretty fun. But before getting into more details about the Riom trials, it's best to take a step back and discuss the creation of the Vichy government, particularly as it related to the powers of the government and its leader Pétain when compared to what had come before. It's also worth stating here that many of the actions of the Vichy leaders, especially during these early years of the war, were not dictated by Germany. The German government mostly just left the French alone in southern France as long as they continued to abide by the terms of the armistice. The reason that this is important is that many of the Vichy leaders would later claim that their actions were impacted by German opinions and orders, which was really not the case, especially in these early years. One of the first decisions that they made was where to base the new government, and for this, the inland city of Vichy was chosen, at least partially because it did not have any sort of dominant political movement like the larger cities in the unoccupied zone of southern France, like Marseille and Lyon, which were large metropolitan cities with kind of pre-established, power structures. Then, in early July 1940, the Chamber of Deputies in the French Senate would hold a session in which they voted to give Pétain the ability to rewrite the French Constitution as he felt necessary. The vote would go heavily in favor of Pétain. The outcome of this vote, the creation of the Vichy government, would end up in some pretty problematic experiences for France. And later, the legitimacy of this vote would be questioned. It was essentially giving emergency powers to Pétain to rule by decree, and he would use those powers in ways that people would later criticize. And so they would seek to sort of criticize the legitimacy of the vote that gave him those powers. But in many ways, this vote was legitimate. This was the Chamber of Deputies, this was the French Senate, as much of it as could be brought together, and they would vote incredibly in favor of giving him these powers. Once he had the powers, the decrees would begin to flow quite quickly and would completely change how the French government was structured. The first act, with the powers given to him, would see Pétain put in a position of leadership as the head of the new government, without the previous demarcation between prime minister and president, which in the previous system had always been two different individuals. Instead, all of the powers related to the leadership of France were placed on a single person, Pétain. He was then, in the second act, given the ability to form a government, dismiss and appoint ministers, and to put in place new laws as he saw fit. The third act of the new government was to adjourn both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, with no date set on their return. Then at the end of July, another act was put forth which created the Supreme Court of Justice, which would be the court where the Riom trials would take place. The investigation and preparation for the Riom trial would then take until about mid-February 1942. Now, for a trial that was theoretically started to find the root cause of France's failure to properly prepare for the war, it's interesting that the person who led the French military for most of the 1930s, General Gamelin, was only barely involved. Now, he was one of 6 men named as defendants in the case, and he would have the same opportunities as the other men to give an opening statement, be questioned, and then cross-examine witnesses. But then he just didn't. Instead of doing all those things, he would submit a memorandum that gave a detailed accounting of French interwar military policy. However, unlike the other men involved, Gamelin's memorandum was far more in line with the viewpoints of the Vichy officials, criticizing the Popular Front government and pointing to its period in power as the origin point of France's failure. Most of his criticisms were in line with the typical criticisms leveled against the French socialists from those on the political right at this point in time, pointing to things like pacifism and a level of decadence that sort of robbed France of its martial spirit in some way. While Gamelin would give this statement in writing, this was his only real contribution to the trial because he refused to participate in discussions or in questioning. Here were his reasons. Quote, "Today I cannot present my defense without risking identifying some names, French or foreign, that the greater good of the nation must protect from these proceedings. Likewise, I would be forced to mention the responsibilities of men who found themselves under my authority, that I consider it my duty or my honor to protect, and whom I would thus risk offending." End quote. Gamelin's refusal to participate in the trial in any meaningful way was an interesting course of action. On one side, it had the intended effect of protecting the French army because Gamelin was the person who could speak to the actions and decisions that led to the French army sort of arriving where it was in May 1940. But at the same time, his silence also made it more difficult for the problems of the French army to be pinned upon the political leaders like Daladier and Blum. It was also just a clear act of defiance against the new regime, one so prominently featuring Gamelin's successor, Weygand. And this act of defiance did not go unnoticed. This episode of History of the Second World War is sponsored by Acorns. Acorns makes it easy to start automatically saving and investing, so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. You don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got now. You could start with $5 or even just your spare change. Financial decisions sometimes feel like insurmountable mountains, but let Acorns do the hard part. All you have to do is sign up, and in that 5 minutes, you've taken the first small steps towards getting you and your money on track. So head over to acorns.com/SWWpod or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC and SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/SWWpod.
My name is Jordan Grummett, and I am the author of The Purpose Code. In my 20 years working as a hospice doctor, I've explored the topic of purpose with individuals on their final journey. And as a financial expert and podcaster, I've challenged entrepreneurs, authors, and CEOs with a simple question: why? What emerged from my extensive research is profound. Purpose isn't just a luxury. It's a vital link to health, longevity, and happiness. Yet over 90% of us grapple with purpose anxiety throughout our lives. How do we reconcile this paradox? With the Purpose Code, I offer a transformative guide that will diminish anxiety, amplify happiness, and help you craft a legacy that endures.
The Purpose Code is available wherever fine books are sold.
One man who would absolutely use every possible speaking opportunity that he was given was Leon Blum. Blum had been the leading figure of the Popular Front movement, which had rode a wave of public support to form the socialist-led government in 1936, right at the beginning of the period that the Riom trials were set to investigate. Along with Daladier, he was the leading figure on which blame was being placed, sort of by the structure of the Riom trials. And instead of shying away from those charges, he leaned into them and he attacked. During his opening statement, he would question the entire concept of the trial and the court, saying, quote, "Sirs, your mission is to establish and punish those responsible. For what? A military defeat? Yet by your indictment, you have already removed from the proceedings all that concerns the conduct of military operations." End quote. Blum here was alluding to the fact that the court had set the end date for its investigation to September 3rd, 1939, which meant that it specifically did not include the period during which the French were actually invaded by the Germans, which Blum claimed made it a bit difficult to discuss the causes of a military failure when they could not discuss the failure of the military. To close out his opening statement, Blum would deliver one of the best quotes of the entire trial, and with it also make clear that he was not going to just roll over for the Vichy government at this trial. Quote, "If the Republic must remain accused, we will stay at our battle station as its witnesses and its defenders." End quote. After Blum's statement was complete, another problem for the government was introduced when one of his attorneys announced before the court that the French press within the Vichy zone had been given a specific list of instructions on how the trial should be discussed and covered within their newspapers. Now, obviously, this did not impact the press within the Vichy zone. They just did not report on what was said, as they were told to do. But the press that were from the wider world or from the occupied zone of northern France were not under any restrictions. They were not censored in any way. In reality, the attempts by the Vichy government at censorship during the trial were a bit amateurish, they were a bit ill thought out, and they did nothing to help the credibility of the Vichy government outside of the territory that they already controlled. And that was one of the purposes of the trial in the first place, to kind of build legitimacy, and they were already sort of torpedoing those efforts. While Blum cast himself as the defender of the Republic during his opening statements, when it was Daladier's turn to speak, he went straight for Pétain. After stating that he made the decision to give more money to French rearmament than any prime minister in the history of France, he began to bring out documents from Pétain's time as Minister of War in 1934. The most important of these was a document that Pétain had written that called for a reduction in armament spending in 1934, a reduction, not an increase. Now, Daladier's purpose with this document was not just to cast a shadow on Pétain and the Vichy leaders, but also to make it clear to the court that by restricting the time under question in the ways that the court was doing, just between 1936 and September 1939, there were critical pieces of information that were difficult to bring forward. And he was right. The decisions and actions of governments and nations during the interwar years were irrevocably linked between years and decades. What was happening in 1936 or 1939 had its roots a decade or more earlier, and it was only by digging into the events that the reason and causes of the decisions in 1940 could be determined. Obviously, I completely agree with this line of thinking. It's essentially the entire driving force behind how this podcast has been structured. Daladier would end his opening statements by another direct attack at Pétain. Quote, "Pétain seeks to dishonor the Republic after having fought for it in World War I. Was it the Republic that in 1934 reduced armament credits? Was it the Republic that prevented Marshal Pétain, Minister of War in 1934, from presenting a French plan for rearmament in response to German actions? Was it the Republic that is responsible for the misconduct or the breakdown in morale that we will cover during the course of these proceedings? Neither the Republic nor the institutions of liberty led France to defeat." End quote. The next session after Daladier had made his statement was again filled with the discussion about the time frame under review. One of Daladier's lawyers just came out and accused the court of protecting Pétain and Weygand by choosing a time period during which they were not in office. Blum would add some emphasis to this with a specific example related to Germany. He pointed out that Germany had left the League of Nations at the end of 1933 and then had openly declared the return of conscription and mandatory military service for all males in March 1935. However, during this period, the French Minister of War did not push for an increase in readiness for the French army or for an increase in the overall military budget. Instead, France continued as it had before, with the Minister of War, of course, being Pétain. During the next session, Daladier came under more direct attack from the government because he had spent some time as Minister of War before 1939, but he was able at least to deflect the blame by stating that he simply continued the policies put forward by Pétain, the person who had preceded him. And regardless, Daladier could point out that the Minister of War, while responsible for the political side of the military, was not responsible for choosing exactly which things that the military budget should be spent on, or how it was used, or what the war plans were. Daladier made it clear that any questions about the efficacy of military spending had to be concerned with those topics, and for those topics they would need to talk to somebody else. This entire line of questioning of Daladier was deeply problematic for the Vichy leaders, because at all times Daladier could fall back on what Pétain's views were, or what Weygand's views were or actions were. For example, due to the success that the Germans had with their armored divisions in France, the obvious question that was asked was why the French did not have other sort of effective armored units in the German style. When they attempted to blame Daladier, he simply stated that Pétain had always emphasized the tank's value in supporting the infantry. And even though he supported and had been a part of the creation of the 1st Armored Division, it was too late to make a difference. Another of the major challenges that the Vichy government would have when questioning the defendants is that men like Daladier could pull in information that many within the court did not at that time know that was sort of part of the case. For example, in December 1939, Weygand had authorized the dispatch of anti-tank weapons to Turkey. And if Weygand believed that there were extra anti-tank weapons in France in December 1939, why was he being blamed, that he being Daladier, being blamed for there not being enough in September 1939? The military thought there was, so why should a politician differ? Along with overall military spending, Daladier would also be questioned at length about his views and decisions on the Maginot Line. While later generations would question why the French spent so much money on the Maginot Line at this point in history or during the 1920s and 1930s, during the questioning at Riom, the question was why they hadn't spent more. On this topic, he was able to point out that it was his government which had authorized a 2.5 billion franc construction of fortifications budget that included the Maginot Line. When the topic of why the Maginot Line was not extended further north, Daladier would point to the fact that in 1927, the French Supreme War Council had advised against fortifying the areas in the north. The reason for this were that it would be difficult due to the shape of the border and the fact that the locations of sort of major industrialized cities were in the wrong spot. The geography that surrounded those cities would be difficult to build on. There were all kinds of problems. This allowed Daladier to simply claim that whatever role he played in not extending the Maginot Line further north, he was simply sort of following the advice of the military experts from 1927. And as a politician, like, what else was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to not listen to them? Oh, by the way, did I mention the vice president of the Supreme War Council in 1927, which made those recommendations? That was Marshal Pétain, of course. With the Riom trial being covered by the international press, answers like this would make headlines. As an example, on March 1st, 1942, the New York Times would have a story with the headline, quote, "Daladier accuses Pétain of neglect. Ex-premier at Riom trial lays responsibility for defense weaknesses to Marshal. He cites Sedan. War Council headed by Pétain vetoed his plan for forts in region, he testifies." End quote. This was not a great look for the Vichy government abroad, headlines like that, which was still, again, trying to use this to gain some level of international recognition. The final day that Daladier would be questioned on would be during the 6th session, which was on March 3rd. The focus during this session was once again on the funds available for rearmament during the 1930s. But again, Daladier was able to deflect blame from himself by pointing out that Pétain had actually reduced the spending on industrial mobilization efforts in the year before Daladier had become Minister of War in 1936. This session would end sort of the direct questioning of Daladier in what had been a completely disastrous set of sessions for the Vichy government. Daladier had been able, in almost every case, not just to deflect any blame from his actions, but more importantly, to tie any of the accusations back to Pétain or other Vichy leaders. The session following the last of Daladier's questions would be focused on one of the former ministers of aviation, Guy Lacambray. One French chronicler of the events at Riom would write that Lacambray, quote, in a good political trial, it's necessary to have at least one acquitted, end quote. And this was kind of the guy that this chronicler was claiming was basically there to be acquitted. And it's kind of easy to see why this was the case, because it would be very difficult to blame or, really focus any real blame on Lacambray, who'd been put in a very bad situation when he became Minister of Aviation in January 1938. To quote Lacambray himself, quote, "We were 5 years behind. That is a tough disadvantage to overcome," end quote. Which was absolutely correct, because the Luftwaffe had begun its rearmament program years before, particularly with large investments in the aviation industry dating back to 1933, and the French only really got serious about it in 1938. After Lacambray's questioning was complete, the trial moved on to Leon Blum. Now Blum, much like with his opening statement, was very ready, just like Daladier had been, for his questioning to begin. One witness would claim that Blum appeared to be looking forward to his questioning, and in fact, Blum had prepared a long and detailed history of the Popular Front and its role in France's preparations for war. And this would begin from the very start of Blum's questioning session, as he started pulling back from this very detailed history and pulling it forward. And the government had given him some really easy angles of attack. There were some really dumb things, kind of just sloppy mistakes, like clearly sort of displayed the inability of the Vichy government to prepare for any real resistance from the defenders. For example, one of these was the fact that there were several different decisions and actions that Leon Blum and the Popular Front were accused of making that did not actually happen when they were in power. Some happened before the Popular Front came to power in June 1936, and some after he left office in June 1937. This, of course, tied into Blum's earlier critiques, which he would reiterate that it was disingenuous for the trial to be based on the very specific set of dates that the Vichy government had sort of suggested. Blum would also go further in his critique of specifically Vichy leader Pierre Laval, who had been a major decision-maker for the Vichy government in 1940 before being removed by Pétain in December 1940. Laval would then later be brought back into the government after the trial ended based on German sort of demands. It's a kind of a long story. But Laval had been a major advocate for reducing the spending of the French government during the 1930s, with government spending being the biggest sort of dividing line between those on the left and right in France during the 1930s. If you remember back to the Third Republic episodes, which were, I recognize, quite some time ago, one of the major challenges for the French government during the mid-1930s is that their resistance to government spending increases and their sort of slavish adherence to the gold standard had served them well during the early years of the Great Depression. But by the mid-1930s, as the economies of other nations began to recover, the French recovery was far more sluggish due to the same policies that had helped them in earlier years. Laval was one of the leading voices for a reduction of government spending and the balancing of the budget, which made it really hard to kind of ramp up rearmament spending when you're very concerned about having a balanced budget. Now, Blum brought this up because Blum and Daladier were being accused of kind of not being willing, not being able, and just simply not increasing military spending. But Blum was able to say, like, look at this person from within the Vichy government, look at his resistance to increases in spending. They had not really allowed government spending to rise because there was so much resistance from others within French politics. During the two sessions in which he was questioned, Blum, much like Daladier before him, went on kind of long monologues on many of the topics that were discussed, which was a bit odd and maybe unexpected. One of the reasons that this was allowed was because of the decisions made by the President of the Court, or Chief Justice, Pierre Causse. Now, he did not cut off either of the defendants, except for reminders from time to time to return to the topic under discussion. This freedom of narrative provided by the president of the court was essentially used like a weapon by Daladier and Bloom. They were really good at kind of picking out information, really picking apart the government's case, and they were given the freedom to do so, which I guess is good for them, and an interesting choice by the Chief Justice. After the 2 sessions during which Bloom was questioned, the trial moved on to discuss the actions of Robert Jacome, the former Inspector General of the Army, and also the least well-known of any of the defendants. Once this was complete, there was a period where witness testimony was presented before the court. In many cases, the goal of the government with these witnesses was to prove that the French army was neglected. They sort of talked about inadequate equipment, demoralized troops, a lack of training, and other related topics. But few of the witnesses stood up well to the cross-examination from Bloom and Daladier, who were both very active in their questioning. On April 2nd, the court would take a scheduled break for Easter, with the plan being to come back after the holiday to continue witness testimonies. But then, it didn't. Instead, it was announced on April 11th that the Riom trial was being suspended through the creation of a new law. Obviously, the trial was not going as planned for the Vichy government, and instead of a trial focused on assigning blame to the defendants, it had instead turned into an indictment of the Vichy government itself. Due to this change, there was also pressure from the Germans for the trial to end very quickly, because the last thing they wanted in the spring of 1942, when they were knee-deep in the campaign in Russia, was for some kind of revolt or political uncertainty or civil war to break out in unoccupied France, and so they would request that the trial be ended. With the trial suspended, the 3 primary defendants would remain imprisoned, and then in March 1943, Bloom, Daladier, and Gamelin were all turned over to German authorities, where they would remain until the spring of 1945, with Bloom being sent to the Birkenwald concentration camp. And so what had started as a trial with tremendous fanfare, designed to determine who to blame for the failures of the French army in the spring of 1940, had instead turned into an airing of grievances against many of the Vichy leaders. It goes down in history as a great example of, if you're going to start something approaching a show trial, then you better be able to control the show. Daladier and Bloom were given too much freedom, too much ammunition, and simply too many facts that they could pull from in their defense. The moment that they decided that they would not go quietly, the trial was doomed to failure. It would represent the second time that the French government had been defeated by an opposition, due specifically to that opposition choosing a bold offensive. But sure, the first time it had been German armored units crashing through the Ardennes that had caused the defeat of France on the battlefield. But the second time the French government had been defeated in the courtroom by its own former members who chose a similarly bold strategy. And once again, the French leaders were caught with a conservative strategy that was ill-prepared for such an offensive action. Thank you for listening to this series of episodes on the fall of France in 1940. We'll come back to France in future episodes to talk about the occupation, to talk about the resistance, and other French topics, but for now we're going to leave France behind and turn to its northern neighbor and still ally in the summer of 1940, Great Britain. That's right, the next series of the podcast will be covering the Battle of Britain. Although it will be a few weeks before that gets started, there's going to be kind of a break between seasons here as I prepare for the next episodes. You can expect some content here on the podcast feed, some old member episodes that I'm bringing out for everybody, some new summary episodes, and maybe a couple of interviews. You can find out more about the plans for the podcast in 2025 by heading over to the Patreon page, a link for which can be found at historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members. As always, thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And I guess just thank you for caring about history. Yeah, thank you.